There's nothing lonelier than being surrounded by everything you ever wanted, yet having no one to share it with. Vivienne Harcourt learned this truth every morning as she walked through rooms filled with memories of the husband she'd lost 3 years ago. One autumn afternoon, she found a young man kneeling on her driveway with a worn toolbox beside him. "I'll fix your mansion, and you give me a job," he said simply. Most wealthy widows would have called security. But this stranger wasn't asking for money or pity. He was offering honest work with hands that looked like they knew how to build things, not break them. She had lawyers and advisors, but no one who offered to actually fix what was broken. 3 years of loneliness had taught her that money could buy everything except the one thing she needed most. Could this homeless man with calloused hands really repair what grief had shattered? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of the Harcourt estate, casting long shadows across marble floors that had once echoed with laughter. Vivienne stood in her silk robe at the grand staircase, holding a cup of coffee that had grown cold in her hands. The ritual never changed. Wake at 6, coffee in the conservatory, then the slow walk through 17 rooms. That felt more like a mausoleum than a home, her reflection caught in the antique mirror at the landing. At 52, she remained striking, her blonde hair swept into an elegant chignon, her blue eyes still sharp despite the weight of grief they carried. Richard had always said she looked like Grace Kelly, and she'd worn that comparison like armor through decades of charity galas and business meetings. Now it felt like a costume she couldn't remove. The estate sprawled across 47 acres of Connecticut countryside, a testament to the telecommunications empire she and Richard had built together. Every room held memories: the library where they planned their first acquisition, the conservatory where Richard had proposed on bended knee 28 years ago, the workshop he'd converted from an old carriage house where he'd spent weekend mornings crafting furniture with his hands. She paused outside the workshop's locked door, her fingers unconsciously turning the platinum wedding band she still wore beneath Richard's simple gold one. The key hung on a ribbon in her jewelry box, untouched since the funeral. Mrs. Chen had suggested clearing it out, but Vivienne couldn't bear the thought of disturbing Richard's sacred space. "Mrs. Harcourt?" Mrs. Chen's gentle voice interrupted her reverie. The housekeeper had worked for them for 15 years, arriving as a young woman from Taiwan and now serving as both employee and surrogate daughter. "Your breakfast is ready." Vivienne nodded, following the familiar path to the morning room. Mrs. Chen had prepared her usual fresh fruit, whole grain toast, and orange juice she wouldn't drink. The older woman's dark eyes held the same concern they'd carried for 3 years, watching her employer waste away despite having everything money could provide. "The gardener called in sick again," Mrs. Chen said, setting down a crystal glass. "That's the 3rd time this month." Marcus had been their groundskeeper for a decade, a reliable man in his 60s who took pride in maintaining the estate's pristine appearance. Lately, his arthritis had been winning the battle against the sprawling lawns and elaborate flower beds Richard had designed. "Perhaps we should consider hiring additional help," Vivienne said, though she knew she was reluctant to bring new people into her carefully controlled world. After Richard's death, she dismissed most of the staff, unable to bear their pitying glances and whispered condolences. Through the French doors, she could see the morning light illuminating the fountain Richard had imported from Italy for their 10th anniversary. He'd surprised her with it after a particularly difficult business negotiation, saying every home needed something beautiful that served no purpose except joy. The water hadn't flowed in 2 years, another thing, requiring repair that she couldn't bring herself to address. The estate had become a monument to postponed maintenance and avoided decisions. Shutters hung slightly askew. Gutters needed cleaning. and the greenhouse Richard had loved showed spider webs of cracked glass. She had the money to fix everything tomorrow, but each repair felt like erasure of the life she'd shared with her husband. Her phone buzzed with the day's first interruption, her assistant confirming a board meeting she'd been postponing for weeks. Harcourt Communications continued to generate wealth without her direct involvement, run by capable executives who sent reports she barely read. The company that had once been her passion now felt like an obligation, a machine that churned profits. While she wandered through empty rooms, Mrs. Chun cleared the untouched breakfast with practiced efficiency. "Will you be going out today?" Vivienne shook her head. She rarely left the estate except for necessary business meetings or medical appointments. The outside world felt too bright, too loud, too full of couples holding hands and families laughing together. Here, surrounded by familiar silence, she could maintain the careful equilibrium that kept her functioning. The doorbell's chime echoed through the foyer, an unusual sound in a house where visitors required appointments and deliveries went to the service entrance. Mrs. Chun hurried to answer it, her voice carrying faintly as she spoke with someone outside. Vivienne remained in the morning room, assuming it was another salesperson or charity solicitor to be politely dismissed. But Mrs. Chun returned with an expression of uncertainty. "There's a young man at the door. He says he wants to speak with you about work." "Work?" Vivienne frowned. "Did he have an appointment?" "No, ma'am. He's been waiting by the gates every morning this week. I've seen him when I arrive." Mrs. Chun hesitated. "He looks homeless, but he's not asking for money. He has tools with him." Vivienne's first instinct was to refuse. She had no patience for disruptions to her carefully maintained solitude. But something in Mrs. Chun's tone suggested this wasn't an ordinary encounter. The housekeeper was an excellent judge of character, having dealt with her share of opportunists over the years. "What does he want?" "He says he'll fix whatever needs. Fixing in exchange for steady work. He seems—" Mrs. Chun searched for the right word. Respectful, desperate, but not dangerous. Through the window, Vivienne caught a glimpse of a figure by the front steps, a man in his 30s with dark hair and clothing that had seen better days. He sat patiently beside a worn leather toolbox, not presuming to approach the door again, but not leaving either. There was something in his posture that spoke of military bearing, a straightness to his spine despite his circumstances. She thought of Marcus's aching joints, and the growing list of repairs she couldn't bring herself to authorize. The fountain that no longer danced, the shutters that hung crooked, the greenhouse slowly surrendering to neglect. Perhaps this stranger's arrival wasn't coincidence, but necessity finally forcing her hand. "I'll speak with him," she said, surprising herself with the decision. Mrs. Chun's eyebrows rose slightly, but she nodded. "Shall I bring him to the sitting room?" "No." Vivienne stood, smoothing her robe and checking her reflection in the hallway. "Mirror, I'll meet him outside." The autumn air carried the scent of dying leaves and wood smoke from a neighbor's chimney. The stranger rose as she approached, his movements careful and respectful. Up close, she could see he was younger than she'd first thought, perhaps 35, with green eyes that held depths of experience beyond his years. His clothes were clean but worn, his boots sturdy despite their age. "Mrs. Harcourt," he said, extending a calloused hand. "Thank you for seeing me. I'm Jake Morrison." His handshake was firm but brief, his voice carrying a slight southern accent that spoke of manners learned young and never forgotten. She found herself studying his face, noting the lines around his eyes that suggested both laughter and sorrow, the careful way he held himself, as if accustomed to standing at attention. "Mr. Morrison," she replied, surprised by her own politeness. "Mrs. Chun tells me you're looking for work." "Yes, ma'am. I've been watching your property, and I can see it needs attention. The kind of attention that takes skill, not just money." He gestured toward the fountain. "That pump assembly is probably clogged with mineral deposits. Your gutters need cleaning, and realignment. The greenhouse has stress fractures that'll get worse with winter coming. She was impressed despite herself. Most people saw only the estate's grandeur, missing the subtle signs of neglect that spoke to a trained eye. "And you can fix these things?" "I can fix anything that's broken, ma'am." 20 years in the Army Corps of Engineers teaches a man to solve problems with whatever tools he has. He paused, his expression growing serious. "I'm not asking for charity. I'm offering honest work for fair pay." There was dignity in his words, a pride that poverty hadn't managed to break. She recognized something in his bearing, the same quiet strength Richard had possessed. The confidence of a man who knew his own worth regardless of circumstances. "What makes you think I need help?" Jake's eyes swept over the estate with professional assessment. "Beautiful place like this, it's meant to be maintained with love. I can see it was once, but it's been neglected lately, and that kind of neglect spreads if you don't stop it." His words hit closer to home than she cared to admit. The estate's decay mirrored her own, still beautiful on the surface, but slowly surrendering to entropy. Underneath, "I don't make impulsive decisions, Mr. Morrison." "No, ma'am, I wouldn't expect you to. But maybe you could give me one small job. Let me prove what I can do." He gestured toward the front door. "That brass hinge on your door has been sticking, probably for months. 5 minutes work for someone who knows what they're doing." She looked at the door, remembering how she'd been forcing it lately, assuming it was just the old house settling. That he'd noticed such a small detail spoke to his observational skills, and perhaps to how long he'd been watching the property. 5 minutes? "Yes, ma'am. If I can't fix it, you're out nothing but time." Vivienne found herself nodding, curious despite her reservations. "Very well, Mr. Morrison. Show me what you can do." Jake knelt beside his toolbox with the reverence of a surgeon preparing for delicate work. The worn leather case opened to reveal tools that had seen decades of use but were meticulously maintained, each piece clean, sharp, and arranged with military precision. Vivienne watched from the doorway as he selected a small bottle of oil and a narrow brush, handling them with the care of someone who understood that good tools were the foundation of honest work. "This hinge is original to the house," he said, running his fingers along the brass hardware. "Probably installed in 1924, judging by the craftsmanship. They made things to last back then, but even the best hardware needs attention after 90 years. He worked with quiet concentration, first cleaning away decades of accumulated grime and oxidation. His movements were economical and precise, each action serving a specific purpose. Vivienne found herself drawn closer, fascinated by the methodical way he approached this simple task. "The pins are still good," Jake continued, his voice taking on the tone of someone who understood machinery at an intuitive level. "Just needed cleaning and proper lubrication. Most people would have replaced the whole assembly, but these old pieces have character worth preserving." As he worked, Vivienne noticed other details about him, the way his hands moved with confidence despite their obvious calluses, the fact that he worked in silence rather than filling the air with unnecessary chatter, the respectful distance he maintained from her personal space. There was something almost meditative about watching him work, a peaceful focus that reminded her of Richard in his workshop. "There," Jake said, standing and wiping his hands on a clean rag. "Try it now." Vivienne approached the door hesitantly, grasping the heavy brass handle she'd struggled with for months. The door swung open with silent ease, closing just as smoothly when she tested it. The improvement was dramatic. What had been a daily annoyance was now effortless. "How did you know exactly what was wrong?" Jake smiled, the expression transforming his serious face. "Experience mostly, but also listening. That hinge had a particular sound when it stuck metal binding against metal without proper lubrication. After 20 years of maintaining equipment, In places where failure meant lives lost, you learned to read those signals. The mention of military service explained much about his bearing and precision. Where did you serve? Afghanistan, mostly. 3 tours with the Corps of Engineers. His expression grew distant for a moment. We built bridges, repaired infrastructure, kept the machinery running that kept people alive. There was weight in those words, layers of experience and responsibility. That spoke to the kind of person he was. Vivienne found herself reassessing her initial assumptions about this homeless stranger. Whatever circumstances had brought him to her doorstep, his military service suggested honor and capability. The work you did must have been important. It was. Every day, every repair mattered. Jake closed his toolbox with practiced efficiency. That's why I take pride in doing things right. Even small things like door hinges. Quality work is quality work, whether it's in a war zone or a beautiful home like this. Vivienne studied his face, noting the way his eyes lingered on the estate's architectural details, the carved stonework, the leaded glass windows, the careful proportions that made the house a work of art as much as a residence. He saw beauty where others might see only expensive materials. Mr. Morrison, you've proven your skill with this repair, but I'm curious about your circumstances. How does someone with your background find himself without steady employment? Jake's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and she saw a flash of pain in his eyes before he answered. Sometimes life takes everything away at once, ma'am. Sometimes you lose so much that you forget how to function in the regular world. The honesty in his voice caught her off guard. She recognized the sound of profound grief, the careful way someone spoke when raw wounds were still healing. Whatever had brought him to this point, it wasn't laziness or poor character. I see. She paused, weighing her words carefully. The estate does need attention, as you've observed. But I want to be clear about expectations. This isn't charity, and it isn't a temporary solution to your circumstances. If I were to employ you, I'd expect professional work and complete reliability. You get both, ma'am. I may not have much left, but I still have my word and my skills. The simplicity of that statement carried more weight than any elaborate promise. Vivienne found herself thinking of the growing list of repairs that needed attention, not just the obvious cosmetic issues, but the deeper maintenance that kept the house, this size, functioning properly. There's a cottage on the property, she said, surprising herself with the words. It was built for the original groundskeeper. It's been empty for years, but it's structurally sound. It would be part of your compensation, along with a fair wage. Jake's eyes widened slightly, and she saw something that might have been hope flicker across his features. Mrs. Harcourt, think about it, she interrupted, not ready to commit fully but intrigued by the possibility. I'll give you 1 week to prove yourself. If your work meets my standards, we can discuss a permanent arrangement. What would you like me to start with? Vivienne considered the question, thinking of all the projects she'd been avoiding. The fountain in the courtyard hasn't worked in 2 years. If you can restore it to working order, that would demonstrate both your technical skill and your respect for the property's character. Jake nodded, his expression serious. I'll need to examine the pump system and trace the water lines. May take a day or 2 to diagnose the problem properly. Take whatever time you need. Mrs. Chun will show you to the cottage and provide you with a key to the grounds. I assume you have references? I do, ma'am. My last commanding officer and a contractor I worked with in North Carolina. Good men who'll speak honestly about my character and abilities. I'll need their contact information. She paused, studying his face. Mr. Morrison, I want you to understand something. This estate has been my sanctuary since my husband's death. I value my privacy and my peace. If you prove unreliable or disruptive, you'll never know I'm here unless you need something fixed, Jake said quietly. I understand grief, Mrs. Harcourt, I understand the need for quiet spaces where the world can't intrude." Again, his words carried depths of personal experience that resonated with her own losses. Whatever had brought him to her doorstep, they shared the common bond of people who had survived devastating loss. "Very well. Mrs. Chun will help you get settled. I'll expect daily progress reports on your work." "Yes, ma'am." "And Mrs. Harcourt?" Jake shouldered his toolbox. "Thank you for giving me this chance. I won't disappoint you." As he walked away with Mrs. Chun toward the groundskeeper's cottage, Vivienne remained by the newly repaired door. She tested the hinge again, marveling at how smoothly it operated. Such a small thing, yet it represented the first improvement to the estate in 3 years. She thought about Richard, wondering what he would have made of her decision. He'd always been a good judge of character, able to see past surface circumstances to the person underneath. Something told her he would have approved of giving Jake Morrison a chance to prove himself. The autumn sun was climbing higher, warming the air and casting the estate in golden light. For the first time in months, Vivienne found herself looking forward to seeing what tomorrow might bring. Perhaps it was time to stop avoiding the world and start allowing it back in. One careful repair at a time. The first 3 days established a rhythm that surprised Vivienne with its comfort. Jake arrived each morning at 7, exchanged quiet greetings with Mrs. Chun, and set to work with the focused intensity of someone grateful for purpose. From her bedroom window, Vivienne could see him crouched beside the fountain, his tools spread on a canvas tarp as he methodically disassembled the pump mechanism. He worked alone, asking for nothing beyond basic access to water and electricity. Mrs. Chun reported that he'd settled into the cottage with minimal fuss, bringing only a single duffel bag and requesting just basic furnishings. The housekeeper had taken an immediate liking to him, impressed by his politeness and the way he'd insisted on paying for his own groceries despite the cottage arrangement. "He's a good man," Mrs. Chun told Vivienne over breakfast on the 4th morning. "Quiet, respectful. He fixes his own meals and keeps everything clean. Yesterday, I saw him talking to Marcus about the arthritis remedies his grandfather used." Marcus had been skeptical of the newcomer, protective of his territory after years of maintaining the grounds. But Jake had approached the older man with deference, asking permission before moving anything and seeking advice about the property's quirks and history. By the 3rd day, Marcus was sharing stories about the estate's early years and pointing out problem areas that needed attention. "What's your assessment of his work?" Vivienne asked, genuinely curious about the fountain project. "Professional. He doesn't rush or take shortcuts. Spends time understanding how things work before trying to fix them." Mrs. Chun refilled Vivienne's coffee cup. "He asked about Mr. Richard's workshop yesterday." Vivienne's hand stilled on her cup. "What did he ask?" "Just wondered about the lot building in the West Wing. Saw he'd noticed the craftsmanship in the house and was curious if Mr. Richard had done woodworking." Mrs. Chun's voice was carefully neutral. "I told him it was private. The workshop had been Richard's retreat, his place for creating beauty with his hands after days spent in corporate boardrooms. He'd been a gifted craftsman, producing furniture and decorative pieces that filled their home with warmth and personality. Since his death, Vivienne couldn't bear to enter the space where his presence remained strongest. He noticed the quality of Richard's work. He did. Said he could tell the difference between factory pieces and things made with love. Asked if the person who'd done the millwork was local. The observation spoke to Jake's trained eye and appreciation for craftsmanship. Most people assumed their furniture came from expensive designers, not realizing that Richard had created many of their most treasured pieces in his workshop sanctuary. Through the morning room windows, she could see Jake emerging from beneath the fountain base, his shirt damp with perspiration despite the cool October air. He sat back on his heels, studying something in his hands, probably a component that needed cleaning or replacement. His concentration was total. The same focused intensity she'd seen in Richard when he was solving a complex engineering problem. "Mrs. Chen, what do you know about his background?" The housekeeper considered her words carefully. "He doesn't talk much about personal things, but I can tell he's educated the way he speaks, his manners. And he knows construction inside and out. Yesterday, he noticed that the northwest corner of the house needs tuck pointing before winter. That's not something an amateur would catch." Vivienne had been dreading that repair pointing out the gradual deterioration meant admitting the house was aging, despite her efforts to preserve everything exactly as Richard had left it. But Jake had identified the problem with the matter-of-fact assessment of someone who understood that maintenance was love made visible. "Has he mentioned family? Where he came from?" "North Carolina, I think. But he doesn't talk about people he's left behind." Mrs. Chun's tone suggested she'd formed her own theories about Jake's circumstances. "He has the look of someone carrying heavy memories." That afternoon, Vivienne found herself walking through the house with new eyes, noticing details Jake had mentioned in his brief progress reports. The slight gap in the library's crown molding where the house had settled. The way certain floorboards creaked in a pattern that suggested loose subflooring. The beautiful but aging window putty that would need replacement before winter's freeze-thaw. Cycles caused damage. Richard had always handled these observations, his engineer's mind cataloging maintenance needs and scheduling repairs with military precision. After his death, Vivienne had simply stopped seeing the small problems, overwhelmed by the larger reality of his absence. But Jake's professional assessment was reawakening her awareness of the house as a living thing requiring constant care. His reports were brief but thorough, written in neat handwriting that suggested careful education. He noted not just problems, but the history behind them, explaining how the house's original builders had solved drainage issues and why certain materials had been chosen for specific applications. On the fifth day, she encountered him directly for the first time since their initial meeting. He was emerging from the basement, his hands blackened with what looked like decades of accumulated grime from the fountain's water lines. "Mrs. Harcourt," he said, stepping aside respectfully, "I found the problem with the fountain system." "Oh?" She tried to sound casual, though she'd been anticipating this moment all week. "The main intake valve seized years ago. Mineral deposits and corrosion. But the pumps are still good. Just needed complete disassembly and cleaning." He gestured toward the basement stairs. "Your husband chose quality equipment, built to last if properly maintained." The mention of Richard sent a familiar pang through her chest, but Jake's matter-of-fact tone made it bearable. He spoke of her husband's choices with professional respect, not the careful sympathy that made her feel like a fragile widow. How much longer for the repair? Should have water flowing by tomorrow afternoon. The system's more complex than it. Looks, recirculating pumps, filtration, even a small heating element to prevent freeze damage. Whoever designed it understood both function and beauty. Richard had spent months planning that fountain, consulting with Italian craftsmen about the stonework and hydraulic engineers about the water system. It had been his gift to her for their 10th anniversary, a centerpiece for the courtyard where they'd hosted summer parties and quiet evening conversations. "He did love beautiful things that served a purpose," she said softly. Jake nodded. "The best engineering is invisible. It just makes life better without calling attention to itself. Like this fountain. Once it's running, people will see dancing, water, and hear peaceful sounds. They won't think about pumps and filtration, but that's what makes the beauty possible." His understanding touched something in her chest she'd thought was permanently numb. Richard had often expressed similar sentiments about the invisible infrastructure that supported visible beauty. "I'll look forward to hearing it run again," she said. Double quotes. "Yes, ma'am. It's going to be something special." As she watched him return to work, Vivienne realized she was beginning to trust this stranger, who'd appeared at her door with nothing but tools and determination. More than that, she was starting to appreciate having someone around who understood the difference between expensive and valuable, between surface appearance and underlying quality. Perhaps Richard's fountain would sing again after all. The sound of water dancing in the courtyard fountain reached Vivienne's bedroom window just after dawn on the 6th day. She lay still for a moment, thinking she was dreaming. The gentle splash and gurgle had been absent for so long that her memory had nearly forgotten its music. But as consciousness fully returned, she realized Jake had succeeded in bringing Richard's creation back to life. She rose and wrapped herself in a silk robe, drawn to the French doors that opened onto the courtyard. The fountain stood in golden morning light, water cascading from tier to tier in perfect harmony. The sight hit her with unexpected emotion, not just relief that something broken had been repaired, but wonder at seeing beauty restored to her. Jake knelt beside the fountain's base, making final adjustments to flow rates and checking connections. His movements were careful and precise, the same methodical approach she'd observed all week. When he noticed her watching from the doorway, he stood and approached with respectful distance. "Good morning, Mrs. Harcourt. I wanted to test the system at dawn to make sure everything runs smoothly in different temperatures." "It's beautiful," she said, meaning it completely. "Thank you. Your husband designed something special. The hydraulics are elegant maximum visual effect with minimum energy consumption. And the stonework." Jake gestured toward the carved Italian marble. Whoever selected these pieces understood how water would move across different textures. Richard had indeed spent months choosing each element, consulting with artisans and engineers to create something that would bring daily joy. Hearing it described with such appreciation made Vivienne realize how much she'd missed having someone who understood quality craftsmanship. He would have been pleased to see it working again. Jake nodded gravely. "From what I can tell about his other projects around the house, he had excellent instincts. The built-in shelving in the library, the window seats in the morning room, those are custom pieces made by someone who understood both function and beauty." She was startled by his observation. "How did you know those were his work?" "The joinery techniques, mostly. And the fact that they're designed specifically for this house proportioned perfectly for the rooms, using wood that matches the original millwork exactly. Factory pieces never fit that seamlessly." Jake's expression grew thoughtful. "Mrs. Chun mentioned he had a workshop. He must have been quite skilled." The mention of Richard's workshop sent the familiar tightness through her chest. That sacred space had remained locked since his funeral. Too painful to enter, but too meaningful to clear out. She'd even refused Mrs. Chun's offers to dust and organize, unable to bear the thought of anyone disturbing Richard's final projects. "He was," she said simply. Jake seemed to sense her discomfort and didn't pursue the subject. Instead, he gestured toward his tool bag. "I'd like to start on the gutter cleaning and realignment today, if that's acceptable. The autumn leaves are starting to fall, and clogged gutters can cause foundation problems if water backs up against the house." "Of course, whatever you think is necessary." Over the following days, Jake's presence became a comfortable constant. He worked with quiet efficiency, tackling problems in order of urgency rather than visibility. While most contractors would have focused on obvious cosmetic issues, he prioritized structural maintenance that would prevent expensive damage later. Mrs. Chun reported that he ate simple meals, read books from the cottage's small library, and maintained the kind of disciplined routine that spoke to military training. He asked for nothing beyond basic supplies and seemed content with solitude when work was finished. "He reads quite a bit," Mrs. Chun mentioned during their morning routine. "History, mostly. And he's been sketching the house's architectural details in a notebook." "Sketching?" "Detailed drawings of the millwork and stonework. Very precise, like technical illustrations." When I asked about it, he said, understanding a building's original design helps him maintain it properly. That methodical approach impressed Vivienne. Too many repair people treated houses as collections of separate problems, rather than integrated systems requiring thoughtful care. Jake's respect for the estate's architectural integrity suggested both intelligence and genuine appreciation for quality craftsmanship. On the 9th day, she encountered him in the library as he measured crown molding for what he'd identified as needed repair. He worked carefully around the leather-bound books and antique furniture, protecting everything with canvas claws. "Finding what you need?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am. The gap in this corner molding is wider than I initially thought. The house has settled more than usual in this section." He showed her his measurements, written in the neat handwriting she'd come to recognize. "But it's nothing serious, just needs attention before winter expansion makes it worse." She found herself studying his notebook, impressed by the detailed sketches and precise measurements. His drawings captured not just dimensions, but the elegant proportions that made the room beautiful, the way the molding height related to ceiling dimensions, how the window spacing created pleasing visual rhythms. "You have quite an eye for architectural detail." Jake's expression grew slightly self-conscious. "The army taught me to document everything thoroughly. And my father was a Finnish carpenter. I grew up around people who cared about getting details." "Right. Was he the one who taught you about tools and craftsmanship?" "Partly. But mostly I learned from watching skilled people work and asking questions when they tolerate a curious kid." His voice carried warmth when speaking of those memories. "There's something satisfying about fixing things properly, making them better than they were before." She understood that satisfaction from watching Richard in his workshop, the peaceful concentration that came from creating order and beauty with skilled hands. It occurred to her that Jake might appreciate seeing the kind of work Richard had done, understanding the craftsmanship that went into pieces throughout the house. "Mr. Morrison, would you be interested in seeing my husband's workshop? I think you'd appreciate his approach to woodworking." The words surprised her, even as she spoke them. She'd had no intention of offering such access to Richard's private space. But something about Jake's respectful appreciation for quality work made the offer feel natural rather than intrusive. Jake's eyes brightened with genuine interest. "I'd be honored, Mrs. Harcourt, if you're certain it wouldn't be an imposition." "Let me get the key," she said, already moving toward the stairs. Her hands trembled slightly as she retrieved the small silver key from her jewelry box, tied with the blue ribbon Richard had used. She'd avoided this moment for 3 years, but suddenly it felt like the right time to share Richard's legacy with someone who would truly understand its value. The workshop key felt warm in her palm as she led Jake toward the west wing, toward the space where Richard's presence remained strongest, and his final projects waited in patient silence. The workshop door hadn't opened in 3 years, and the key resisted briefly before turning with a soft click. Vivienne took a steadying breath as the door swung inward, releasing the scent of wood shavings, linseed oil, and the faint cologne Richard had worn. The familiar smells hit her like a physical blow, bringing tears to her eyes before she could stop them. Jake stood respectfully behind her, waiting for permission to enter the sacred space. The afternoon light filtered through dusty windows, illuminating Richard's final projects exactly as he'd left them. His workbench held a half-completed jewelry box, tools arranged with the precision of someone who'd been planning to return the next day. Wood shavings curled beside his favorite plane, and sketches of future projects were pinned to the wall above his drafting table. "My God," Jake whispered, his voice filled with reverence. "This is incredible." He stepped into the workshop with the careful movements of someone entering a cathedral. His eyes swept over the organized tool walls, the lumber racks filled with exotic hardwoods, the machinery that represented a lifetime of accumulated expertise. Everything was covered with a fine layer of dust, but the underlying order and quality were unmistakable. He was a master craftsman, Jake said, approaching the workbench with obvious awe. "Look at this joinery work." He gestured toward a partially assembled cabinet that demonstrated traditional techniques rarely seen in modern furniture. "Those dovetails are perfect cut by hand, not machine." Vivienne found her voice with effort. He learned from his grandfather, who was a cabinet maker in Vermont. Said mass production was fine for some things, but furniture should be built to last generations. Jake nodded, studying the cabinet's construction with professional appreciation. "You can see the love in every cut. This isn't just skilled work, it's art." He moved through the workshop like a student in a master studio, examining tools and techniques with quiet fascination. Richard's handplanes were arranged by size on custom wooden racks. His chisels, some inherited from his grandfather, gleamed, despite the dust. The lumber selection showed both practical knowledge and aesthetic sensibility. Walnut, cherry, maple, and exotic species chosen for their beauty and working properties. "This chess set," Jake said, stopping before Richard's drafting table. He was carving his own pieces? Vivienne approached the table, where Richard's final project lay partially completed. The chess set was carved from ebony and holly, each piece a miniature sculpture demonstrating extraordinary skill. The completed pieces, pawns, rooks, knights, showed intricate detail work that transformed functional game pieces into works of art. "He'd been working on this for 2 years, she said. Softly, "A retirement gift for himself," he said. Something to occupy his hands when he stepped back from the business. Jake examined the pieces with obvious admiration, careful not to touch without permission. "The level of detail is remarkable. Look at the knight's armor, the king's crown. Each piece tells a story." Only half the set was complete: 8 pawns, 2 rooks, and a single knight sat finished on the board. The remaining pieces existed only as rough blanks and detailed sketches showing Richard's vision for each character. Seeing the unfinished work always filled Vivienne with profound sadness, another dream cut short by his sudden heart attack. He had such plans for this room, she said, gesturing toward the space. Wanted to teach woodworking classes for kids, pass on skills that were being lost. Said too many young people didn't know the satisfaction of making something beautiful with their hands. Jake's expression grew thoughtful as he absorbed that information. What a gift that would have been. There's something healing about working with wood, the way it responds to patient, skilled hands. Your husband understood that. The journal lay open beside the chess set, filled with Richard's neat handwriting and detailed sketches of future projects. He'd been planning a hope chest for their future granddaughter, a writing desk for the library, even a garden gazebo where Vivienne could read in the shade. All those dreams remained trapped in ink and imagination. He kept detailed notes about everything, Vivienne said, turning the journal's pages. Lumber sources, joinery techniques, design ideas, even philosophical thoughts about craftsmanship and why it mattered. Jake read over her shoulder, his attention caught by one particular passage. Listen to this, he said softly. A man's hands can build or destroy, create beauty or spread ugliness. The choice reveals his character more clearly than any words. He looked up at Vivienne. Your husband was a wise man. He was. She closed the journal gently. He believed that making beautiful things was a form of prayer, a way of adding goodness to the world. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, surrounded by the evidence of Richard's devotion to his craft. The workshop felt less like a mausoleum and more like a classroom, filled with knowledge waiting to be shared. Jake's presence somehow made it easier to be here, his appreciation for the space honoring Richard's memory rather than disturbing it. Mrs. Harcourt, Jake said carefully, would you mind if I asked what happened to him? Heart attack, sudden and massive. The words came easier now, worn smooth by 3 years of repetition. He was here in the workshop, actually. Mrs. Chung found him the next morning. Jake's expression filled with understanding and sympathy. I'm sorry. To lose someone so suddenly, with so much left unfinished. Yes. She touched the chess set, gently. I used to come here every day after the funeral, sitting in his chair and trying to feel close to him. But eventually, it became too painful. I locked the door and haven't been back until today. Grief takes its own time, Jake said with the voice of someone who understood loss intimately. Sometimes, the places that hurt most are also the places that heal us when we're ready. Something in his tone suggested personal experience with profound loss, but she didn't press for details. They each carried their own burdens, their own unfinished stories. I should let you get back to your work, she said, though she found herself reluctant to leave the workshop now that she'd finally returned to it. Actually, if it wouldn't be presumptuous ... double quotes. Jake hesitated, then continued. Some of these tools could use attention, not damaged, but they'd benefit from cleaning and proper oiling. Is what your husband would have done maintain them so they'd be ready when needed. The suggestion was practical and respectful, offering care rather than change. You'd be willing to do that? It would be an honor. A craftsman's tools deserve respect, and these represent a lifetime of careful selection and use. She found herself nodding, surprised by how right the offer felt. Yes, I think Richard would have appreciated that. He always said tools were only as good as the care they received. I'll be very careful with everything. Document what I do, so you know exactly what's been touched. His thoughtfulness touched her deeply. This man, who'd appeared at her door with nothing, understood the sacred nature of Richard's workspace better than family members, who'd suggested clearing it out for practical purposes. Take whatever time you need, she said. And Jake? Thank you for understanding how important this is. Thank you for trusting me with it, Mrs. Harcourt. It's a privilege to be here. As they left the workshop together, Vivienne felt something shift inside her chest, not the sharp pain of loss, but a gentler ache that suggested healing might be possible. For the first time since Richard's death, his workshop felt like a place of life rather than a monument to endings. Perhaps it was time to let love continue in new forms, carried forward by hands that understood the value of patient, beautiful work. Over the next week, the sound of careful work emerged from Richard's workshop for the first time in 3 years. Jake approached each tool with archaeological precision, documenting its condition before cleaning and oiling with the reverence of someone restoring historical artifacts. Vivienne found herself drawn to the West Wing throughout the day, comforted by the gentle sounds of restoration rather than construction. He's being so respectful, Mrs. Chun reported during their morning coffee. I checked on him yesterday, and he was cleaning each chisel individually, testing the sharpness and making notes in a separate notebook. Said he wanted to understand how Mr. Richard organized everything before making any changes. That methodical approach impressed Vivienne more than dramatic efficiency would have. Jake understood that the workshop was a carefully evolved system. Each tool and material placed with purpose, developed over decades of use. Disturbing that organization would be like scrambling a musical score. Through the workshop windows, she could see Jake working at the bench where Richard had spent countless peaceful hours. He moved with similar patience, taking breaks to study Richard's sketches and journal entries, clearly trying to understand not just the techniques, but the philosophy behind them. On Wednesday afternoon, she brought him coffee and found him reassembling one of Richard's hand planes, its brass components gleaming from careful cleaning. This is a beautiful tool, Jake said, accepting the coffee gratefully. Probably worth more than most people's entire tool collection. Your husband had extraordinary taste in equipment. He said good tools were an investment in every project you'd ever build with them. Jake nodded, testing the plane's adjustment mechanisms. Smart man. This tool will outlast both of us if it's cared for properly. He paused, studying her expression. Mrs. Harcourt, I hope you don't mind me asking, but what will happen to all this when the workshop is restored? It seems like knowledge that should be shared. The question had haunted her for 3 years. Richard's expertise and tool collection represented a lifetime of accumulated wisdom, but she'd been paralyzed by the thought of dispersing his legacy among strangers who might not appreciate its value. I don't know, she admitted. Richard wanted to teach people, pass on traditional skills, but I could never figure out how to honor that wish without losing the essence of what he built here. Jake set down his coffee and gestured around the workshop. What if the teaching happened here? Not classes exactly, but apprentice-style learning. One person at a time, working alongside someone who understood your husband's methods. You mean like you're doing now? Something like that. I've been reading his journal entries about craftsmanship philosophy. He had insights about patience, quality, the satisfaction of doing things right the first time. Those lessons are as valuable as the technical skills. The idea intrigued her despite her instinctive protectiveness. Richard had always believed that knowledge grew through sharing. That skills became stronger when passed to appreciative hands. You're suggesting I find someone to continue his work? I'm suggesting the work is already continuing, Jake said quietly. Just by being here, understanding his methods, caring for his tools, that's carrying his legacy forward. The question is whether you want to expand that or keep it smaller and more personal. Over the following days, she found herself considering that possibility. The workshop had always been Richard's happy place, filled with the satisfaction of creating beauty through patient skill. Allowing that tradition to continue might honor his memory better than preserving it as an untouched shrine. Jake's careful restoration work was revealing the workshop's full potential. Tools that had been gathering dust were returning to functional beauty. The lumber racks were reorganized to highlight the extraordinary wood collection Richard had accumulated. Even the lighting was improved, with careful cleaning of windows and strategic placement of work lamps. He's transforming the space without changing its character, Marcus observed during one of his increasingly frequent visits to check on the progress. The older man had become genuinely fond of Jake, appreciating both his skill and his respectful approach to the estate's history. What do you think of him? Vivienne asked. Marcus considered the question carefully. He's got good hands and a good heart. Reminds me of Mr. Richard in some ways. Takes time to understand things before acting. Respects quality work. Doesn't cut corners. The groundskeeper paused. Whatever brought him here, we're lucky to have him. That assessment meant a great deal coming from Marcus, who'd been protective of Richard's memory and skeptical of anyone trying to fill even a small part of his role. If Jake had earned the older man's trust, it spoke well of his character and approach. Friday evening brought an unexpected development. Vivienne was walking through the house when she heard the distinctive sound of hand-planing coming from the workshop. The rhythmic whisper of sharp steel removing paper-thin wood shavings was a sound she hadn't heard since Richard's death, and it drew her outside despite the cool October air. Through the workshop window, she could see Jake working at Richard's bench, carefully shaping a piece of wood with controlled, practiced strokes. His movements had the same meditative quality she remembered from watching her husband work. The peaceful concentration that came from matching human skill to natural materials. She knocked softly before entering, not wanting to startle him during delicate work. I hope you don't mind, Jake said, looking up from the workbench. I found this piece of walnut that was damaged along one edge, probably from moving lumber around. Rather than waste it, I thought I'd practice some of the techniques I've been reading about in your husband's journal. The wood in his hands was transforming from rough lumber into something with graceful curves and smooth surfaces. His technique wasn't as refined as Richard's had been, but it showed fundamental understanding and genuine feel for the material. You're quite skilled yourself, she observed. I have basic knowledge from growing up around my father's work. But your husband's journal is teaching me things I never learned, not just techniques, but why certain approaches work better than others. Jake set down the plane and showed her a passage he'd marked. Listen to this. Wood has memory and grain. Direction for reasons. Work with both, never against them, and the material will teach you what it wants to become. He spent hours teaching me that same lesson when I tried to help with projects. You worked with him here? Occasionally. I was better at sanding and finishing than precision cutting, but he enjoyed having company while he worked. She smiled at the memory. He said the best part of any project was sharing it with someone who appreciated the process. Jake's expression grew thoughtful. That's something I've missed, having people around who understand why craftsmanship matters. Working alone has its place, but sharing knowledge makes everything richer. Standing in the workshop with tools, humming back to life, and the smell of fresh wood shavings in the air, Vivienne realized she'd missed that sense of shared purpose more than she'd admitted. Richard's legacy wasn't just the beautiful things he'd made, but the joy of creating them with patient, skilled hands. Perhaps it was time to let that joy continue. The photograph fell from Jake's toolbox on a Tuesday morning, fluttering to the workshop floor like an autumn leaf. Vivienne had come to bring him coffee and discuss plans for winterizing the greenhouse. When she saw the faded image lying face-up on the sawdust-covered planks, the picture showed Jake in military dress uniform, his arm around a stunning dark-haired woman holding a little girl who couldn't have been more than 4 years old. All three were laughing at something outside the camera's view, their faces radiant with the kind of happiness that comes from being completely, unself-consciously loved. "I'm sorry," Jake said quickly, kneeling to retrieve the photograph. "It must have come loose from." "Don't apologize," Vivienne said softly, her heart aching at the obvious joy captured in that frozen moment. "They're beautiful? Your family?" Jake's hands trembled slightly as he looked at the image, his expression transforming from the peaceful contentment she'd grown accustomed to into something raw and devastated. For a long moment, he didn't speak, just stared at the faces of people who clearly meant everything to him. He said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Sarah and Emma, my wife and daughter." The past tense hit Vivienne like a physical blow. She'd assumed Jake was alone by choice, perhaps someone who'd never settled down or had suffered through divorce. The reality that he'd lost his family completely recontextualized everything about his circumstances and demeanor. What happened? Jake sat heavily on Richard's work stool, still holding the photograph as if it might disappear. "Car accident. 3 years ago, while I was deployed in Afghanistan. Drunk driver ran a red light and hit them head on." His voice carried the hollow quality of someone who told this story before, but never stopped feeling its impact. "Sarah died instantly. Emma lived for 2 days in the hospital before." He couldn't finish the sentence, and Vivienne felt tears gathering in her own eyes. The thought of losing a child was unbearable enough. Losing both wife and daughter simultaneously while being powerless to help was beyond imagination. "I'm so sorry," she said, knowing the words were inadequate, but needing to offer something. "I was supposed to be home that month. My tour was supposed to end 2 weeks earlier, but we had a bridge project that needed finishing. I chose to stay and complete the work rather than leave it for the next unit." Jake's laugh was bitter and self-recriminating. "If I'd come home when I was supposed to, maybe we'd have been somewhere else that night. Maybe I could have driven instead of Sarah. Maybe." "You can't think that way," Vivienne interrupted gently. "I know because I've tried. After Richard died, I tortured myself with what-ifs. What if I'd insisted he see a cardiologist sooner? What if I'd made him take that vacation he kept postponing? What if I'd been with him in the workshop that morning?" Jake looked up, seeing her pain reflected in his own. "How do you live with it? The not knowing, the guilt, the feeling like you should have been able to prevent it somehow?" Some days I don't know how I live with it, she admitted. Some days I wake up and the reality hits me fresh, like learning about it for the first time. But time doesn't heal. It just teaches you to carry the weight differently. They sat in the workshop surrounded by Richard's tools and unfinished projects. Two people who understood the particular devastation of sudden, inexplicable loss. The autumn light filtered through windows that Jake had carefully cleaned, illuminating the space where one man's dreams had been interrupted and another man's life had been shattered. After the funeral, I couldn't function, Jake continued, his voice gaining strength from sharing the burden. Couldn't go back to work, couldn't stay in our house, couldn't even look at photos without falling apart. The army was understanding. Compassionate leave, offered counseling, tried to help, but I was drowning. What did you do? Ran. Away, basically. Resigned my commission, sold everything, and started moving. Figured if I kept moving, the pain couldn't catch up. He gestured around the workshop. Been homeless for 8 months now, picking up odd jobs when I could, sleeping in my truck when I couldn't find work. The image of this dignified, skilled man reduced to sleeping in a vehicle because grief had stripped away his ability to maintain normal life brought fresh tears to Vivienne's eyes. She thought of her own isolation, how she'd withdrawn from friends and activities after Richard's death, and realized they'd chosen different forms of running away. Why did you stop here? At my estate? Jake studied the photograph again, his thumb tracing the edge where it had been worn smooth by handling. I'd been driving through Connecticut, heading north toward nowhere in particular, when I saw your property. The architecture reminded me of houses Sarah and I used to admire when we dream about the future. She loved beautiful old homes, said. They had souls that modern construction couldn't match. So you decided to stay? I decided to stop running, at least temporarily. Working with my hands again, fixing things instead of just surviving. It felt like the first constructive thing I'd done since losing them. He looked around the workshop with appreciation. And this place, your husband's work, it reminds me that beautiful things can last beyond the people who create them. That legacy can continue even after loss. Vivienne understood that sentiment completely. Richard's workshop had become both a shrine to interrupted dreams and proof that skilled, loving work created meaning that transcended mortality. Is that why you were so careful with everything? Why you took such time to understand Richard's methods? Partly. But also because I recognize grief when I see it, and I knew how precious this space was to you. Jake's expression grew serious. When you showed me his workshop, trusted me with his tools and projects, that meant everything to someone who'd lost faith in his own worth. The confession hung between them, heavy with shared understanding. They'd both been broken by loss, both struggling to find meaning in a world that had taken away the people who mattered most. But somehow, in this workshop filled with evidence of one man's devotion to beautiful work, they'd found a connection that made the weight bearable. Your family would be proud of the work you're doing here, Vivienne said softly. You think so? I know so. Sarah loved beautiful homes, and you're helping preserve one. Emma would have been fascinated watching you work with wood and tools, learning about craftsmanship and patience. She paused, then added, Richard would have liked you. He always said the best measure of a person was how they treated other people's treasures. Jake carefully placed the photograph back in his toolbox, but not hidden away propped where he could see it while he worked. Maybe that's why I ended up here. Maybe they guided me to a place where I could remember that making beautiful things is a form of love. Maybe they did, Vivienne agreed, feeling a peace settle over her that she hadn't experienced in years. Outside, the autumn wind rustled through trees, dropping their last leaves. But inside the workshop, surrounded by tools waiting to create beauty and memories of love that transcended loss, both Jake and Vivienne felt something they thought was gone forever. Hope for tomorrow. The conversation in the workshop changed everything between them. Over the following weeks, Jake and Vivienne worked together with the easy collaboration of people who understood each other's losses and respected each other's strengths. She began spending hours in Richard's workshop, not as a grieving widow, clinging to memories, but as someone rediscovering the joy of creating beautiful things. "I have a proposal," Vivienne said one morning as Jake carefully restored the finish on Richard's drafting table. "Something ambitious that would honor both our spouses' memories." Jake looked up from his work, curious about the determined note in her voice. Over the past month, he'd watched her transform from a woman paralyzed by grief into someone ready to engage with life again. The change had been gradual but unmistakable. Better posture, brighter eyes, genuine smiles when she discovered his latest restoration success. "What do you have in mind?" Vivienne unrolled a set of architectural plans across the newly restored table surface. The yellowed paper showed detailed drawings of the estate as it had been originally designed, with additions and modifications planned but never executed. "These are the mansion's original blueprints from 1924. Richard and I discovered them in the county archives when we first bought the property. Look at this section here." She pointed to a wing of the house that currently sat unfinished, just bare framing and subflooring that had been closed off for decades. Jake studied the drawings with growing interest. The plan showed an elegant addition containing a master craftsman's studio, library, and gallery space designed specifically for displaying handmade furniture and artwork. The architectural details matched the main house perfectly, but the scope was far beyond anything he'd tackled as a solo project. "This would be incredible when completed," he said, "but it's a major undertaking. We're talking months of work. Specialized contractors, significant investment." "I know. That's why I've been researching what it would take." Vivienne spread additional papers across the table: contractor estimates, material lists, timelines for completion. "The structure is sound. It just needs finishing. Electrical, plumbing, flooring, millwork, painting. Most importantly, it needs someone who understands the vision to oversee every detail." Jake examined her research, impressed by its thoroughness. She'd clearly spent considerable time developing a comprehensive plan, consulting with specialists, and developing realistic budgets. This wasn't an impulsive decision, but a carefully considered project. "Why now? What changed your mind about major renovations?" Vivienne was quiet for a moment, organizing her thoughts. 3 years ago, I thought preserving Richard's memory meant keeping everything exactly as he left it. But working with you, seeing how you've honored his craftsmanship while making it useful again, I realized that's not preservation. That's paralysis." She gestured around the workshop, where Jake's careful restoration had brought Richard's tools and workspace back to functional beauty. Everything was clean, organized, and ready for productive work while still maintaining the character and organization Richard had established. "This is how you honor someone's legacy, by continuing their work, not by turning it into a museum." Richard always wanted this wing completed. He had plans for using it as a teaching space, somewhere to pass on traditional skills to people who cared about quality craftsmanship. Jake felt his pulse quicken as he understood the implications of what she was proposing. "You want to finish his vision. Create the workshop and gallery space he planned. I want us to finish it together. Your engineering expertise, your understanding of quality construction, combined with the resources to do it properly." Her voice grew stronger as she spoke. "But more than that, I want to create something that honors both Richard's dreams and Sarah's memory. A place where beautiful things are made and where people can learn that skilled work is a form of love." The mention of Sarah caught Jake off guard, bringing sudden emotion to his throat. How would this honor Sarah? She loved beautiful homes, appreciated craftsmanship and design. Creating a space dedicated to those values making it a place where families could come to learn and create together. Vivienne paused, her voice gentle but certain. I think she'd approve of her husband building something that celebrated the things she treasured. Jake stared at the blueprints, seeing not just architectural plans, but the possibility of purpose beyond survival. For months, he'd been focused on getting through each day without falling apart. The idea of creating something meaningful, something that would last and serve others, felt like stepping back into the light after a long darkness. This would be an enormous project. Are you certain you want to commit to something this ambitious? I've never been more certain of anything. This estate has been a beautiful prison for 3 years. It's time to make it a place of life and creation. Again, Vivienne's expression grew serious. But I need to know you're committed to seeing it through. This isn't just about construction. It's about building something that will continue Richard's legacy and give meaning to everything we've both lost. Jake felt the weight of her trust, the significance of what she was offering. This wasn't just employment or even partnership. It was the chance to create something that honored their spouses. Memories while building a future neither had imagined possible. What about financing? A project this size will be expensive but manageable. The company generates more income than I can spend in several lifetimes. Richard and I always planned to use our wealth for meaningful projects eventually. She smiled sadly. We just ran out of time to do it together. Over the next hour, they worked through the practical details. Jake's military engineering background made him uniquely qualified to manage complex construction projects. Vivienne's business acumen and financial resources would ensure quality materials and skilled subcontractors. Together, they could create something that neither could accomplish alone. There's one more thing, Vivienne said as they rolled up the blueprints. I want this to be a true partnership. Not employer and employee, but partners working toward a shared vision. That means shared decision-making, shared credit, and shared ownership of what we create. Jake was stunned by the generosity of her offer. Vivienne, I can't accept. You can, and you will. This project needs your skills and dedication as much as it needs my resources. Besides, she smiled with genuine warmth. Richard always said, the best work happened when people with complementary talents trusted each other completely. They shook hands formally, sealing an agreement that felt more like a covenant than a business arrangement. As Jake looked around the workshop where they both found healing, he realized this project would be about more than construction. It would be about proving that beautiful things could emerge from brokenness, that love could continue in new forms, and that the dead could guide the living toward purposes they'd never imagined. When do we start? He asked. We already have, Vivienne replied, gesturing toward the blueprints and research materials. The first phase is planning and preparation. I want to do this right, no shortcuts, no compromises. Something worthy of the dreams that inspired it. As they began sketching preliminary timelines and identifying the first critical tasks, both Jake and Vivienne felt the excitement of embarking on something larger than themselves. They were no longer just two broken people finding comfort in shared work. They were partners in creating a legacy that would honor the past while building hope for the future. Outside, the November wind stripped the last leaves from the oak trees, but inside the workshop, spring was already beginning. 3 months into the restoration project, disaster struck on a gray February morning. Jake was in the basement examining the foundation when he discovered what every old house owner fears: a crack running along the main support beam that threatened the structural integrity of the entire addition. How bad is it? Vivienne asked, following him down the narrow stone steps to see the damage herself. Jake ran his flashlight along the beam, revealing a split in the century-old chestnut timber that had been hidden behind decades of accumulated debris. The crack extended nearly the full length of the beam, suggesting stress damage that had been developing slowly over many years. Bad enough that we can't proceed with finishing work until it's addressed. This beam supports the entire east wall of the addition. If it fails completely, he didn't need to finish the sentence. Structural collapse would destroy months of careful work and potentially damage the main house. The discovery threatened everything they'd worked toward. Replacing a main support beam would require massive excavation, specialized equipment, and engineering expertise that would cost tens of thousands of dollars. Worse, it would delay completion by months, potentially making it impossible to finish before the anniversary date they'd set as their goal. Can it be repaired? Vivienne asked, though Jake's expression suggested she wouldn't like the answer. Not safely. This is original post and beam construction. The entire addition was built around this timber. Replacing it means essentially rebuilding from the foundation up. They stood in the basement surrounded by the tools and materials of 3 months. Careful work, facing the reality that even the best planned projects could encounter problems beyond human control. Jake felt the familiar weight of circumstances beyond his influence. The helpless frustration he'd experienced when Sarah and Emma were in the hospital, and there was nothing his skills could do to help. What do you recommend? Vivienne's voice was steady, but he could see the disappointment in her eyes. We have 3 options. Abandon the project and seal off this section permanently. Proceed at significant risk and hope the beam holds long enough to complete the work. Or tear everything down and rebuild properly, which means starting over from zero. None of the options were appealing, but Jake knew from military experience that facing hard choices honestly was the only way to move forward. They could cut their losses, take dangerous risks, or commit to the long, expensive path that would ultimately create what they'd envisioned. Vivienne climbed the basement stairs without speaking, leaving Jake alone with the damaged beam and his racing thoughts. He'd seen construction projects killed by discoveries like this, watched as budget overruns and timeline delays destroyed partnerships and dreams. The smart move would be to recommend abandoning the addition and focusing on maintaining what already existed. But as he examined the beam more closely, his engineer's mind began working on alternative solutions. The timber was damaged but not completely compromised. If they could reinforce it properly while replacing the foundation supports in phases, they might be able to continue work without starting over completely. When he emerged from the basement, he found Vivienne standing in Richard's workshop, staring at the unfinished chess, set as if seeking guidance from her husband's memory. "I've been thinking about what Richard would do," she said without turning around. "He always said that worthwhile projects tested your commitment when circumstances got difficult. This is more than difficult, Vivienne. We're talking about a fundamental structural problem that changes everything about timeline and budget." She turned to face him, her expression resolute. "Then we solve the structural problem. We don't compromise, we don't take shortcuts, and we don't give up on something we believe in because it became harder than expected." Jake felt his heart lift at her determination, even as his practical mind cataloged the challenges they would face. "It's going to cost twice what we budgeted and take months longer than planned. Then that's what it costs and how long it takes. I'd rather have something built right than something built fast." She gestured toward Richard's tools, maintained and organized for work that might never come. "My husband taught me that anything worth creating is worth doing properly, regardless of obstacles." Over the next 2 hours, they developed a new plan that addressed the structural issues while preserving as much of their completed work as possible. Jake's engineering background proved invaluable as he designed a phase reinforcement approach that would stabilize the existing beam while gradually replacing the foundation supports. "This is going to require bringing in specialists," he warned. "Foundation work isn't something we can handle ourselves. Then we find the best specialists available. People who understand that this project matters more than just getting finished. Quickly, as they worked through the technical details, Jake realized this crisis was testing more than their construction skills. It was testing their partnership, their commitment to the vision they'd developed, and their ability to persist when faced with setbacks that would have defeated them individually. "Are you sure about this?" he asked as they finalized the revised plans. "Once we commit to this approach, there's no going back to the simple solution." Vivienne looked around the workshop where they'd found healing and purpose, then met his eyes with complete certainty. "Unsure. We're going to build something beautiful and lasting, no matter what it takes." 6 months later, on a golden September morning, the Richard Harcourt Memorial Workshop opened its doors for the first time. The completed addition gleamed with fresh paint and perfectly fitted millwork, its windows sparkling in sunlight that revealed every carefully crafted detail. Jake stood beside the bronze plaque he designed and cast himself, watching as the first visitors explored the space that had consumed their lives for nearly a year. The memorial read simply, "Richard Harcourt, 1955 to 2021. Master craftsman, devoted husband, believer in beautiful work. A man's hands can build or destroy, create beauty or spread ugliness. The choice reveals his character." "He would have loved this," Vivienne said. Joining him as townspeople, craftsmen, and curious visitors wandered through the gallery space displaying Richard's completed works alongside pieces Jake had crafted. During the construction process, the workshop area hummed with activity as 3 local veterans worked at benches Jake had built using Richard's techniques. The program they developed teaching traditional woodworking skills to homeless veterans had attracted attention from social workers and military support organizations across Connecticut. What had started as a personal healing project had become something that served the broader community. "Mrs. Harcourt, this is incredible," said Mayor Patricia Wells, examining a display case containing Richard's original chess set alongside the pieces Jake had completed using Richard's notes and sketches. "The craftsmanship is museum quality, but it's clearly a working studio. You've created something truly special here." Vivienne smiled, watching Jake demonstrate hand-planing techniques to a group of teenagers whose woodshop teacher had brought them to see traditional methods in action. His natural teaching ability had emerged gradually as the workshop neared completion, revealing talents he'd never had opportunity to develop during his military career. "Jake deserves most of the credit," she said. "He understood the vision and made it reality." The past year had tested every aspect of their partnership. The foundation crisis had been followed by supply delays, weather problems, and the challenge of coordinating multiple specialized contractors while maintaining the project's quality standards. But each obstacle had strengthened rather than weakened their collaboration. "How many people are you planning to serve?" asked Dr. Sarah Chun, Mrs. Chun's daughter who worked with Veteran Support Services in Hartford. "We're starting small," Jake answered, overhearing the question as he finished his demonstration. 6 veterans at a time, 3-month intensive programs, focused on both woodworking skills and general job readiness. The idea is to provide not just training, but a supportive environment where people can rebuild confidence in their abilities. The program structure had evolved through months of discussion with counselors, employment specialists, and veterans organizations. Jake's own experience with grief and displacement informed every aspect of the curriculum, while Vivienne's business background ensured sustainable funding and professional development opportunities. "And this is all provided free of charge?" Dr. Chun asked. "Completely free, including materials, tools, and basic living support for participants who need it," Vivienne confirmed. "The program is endowed through the Harcourt Foundation, so it's designed to continue indefinitely." As the morning progressed, Jake found himself constantly surrounded by people asking questions about techniques, program applications, and the workshop's history. His transformation from homeless drifter to respected craftsman and teacher seemed almost impossible, but Vivienne could see how naturally he'd grown into the role. "There's someone here who wants to meet you," she said, approaching him during a brief lull in visitors. Jake turned to see a woman in her 30s accompanied by two young children, a boy and girl who looked remarkably similar to Emma in his treasured photograph. His breath caught as he realized who they must be. "This is Rebecca Morrison," Vivienne said gently. "She's driven up from North Carolina with her children." Jake's sister-in-law stepped forward with a tentative smile. "Sarah's sister," she explained, unnecessarily. "I heard about what you're doing here through the Veterans Network." Sarah would be so proud, Jake. She always said you had gifts for building and teaching that you'd never fully explored. The mention of his wife's name brought instant tears to Jake's eyes. But for the first time in 4 years, they weren't tears of pure grief. Standing in the workshop, surrounded by evidence of meaningful work, welcomed by family he'd thought lost forever, he felt something he'd forgotten was possible: peace with his memories. "These are Sarah's niece and nephew," Rebecca continued, gesturing toward the children, who were examining the chess pieces with fascination. "They've heard so many stories about Uncle Jake, the engineer, that they insisted on coming to see what you've built." As Jake knelt to show the children how the chess pieces fit together, Vivienne stepped back to observe the scene. The workshop, filled with laughter, learning, and the sounds of productive work, represented everything Richard had dreamed of creating. But it had become something more, a place where broken people could rebuild, not just skills but hope itself. The bronze plaque caught the afternoon light, its inscription a testament to the truth that meaningful work was indeed a choice that revealed character. In choosing to build rather than simply survive, Jake and Vivienne had created something that honored the past while nurturing the future. "Thank you," Jake said quietly, approaching her as the official opening celebration continued around them. "For believing in me when I couldn't believe in myself. For trusting me with Richard's legacy. For showing me that grief doesn't have to be the end of the story." Vivienne clasped his hand warmly. "Thank you for teaching me that preserving love means letting it grow in new directions. Richard's workshop is alive again because you understood that honoring memory means continuing the work, not just protecting what's left behind." As evening approached and the last visitors departed, they stood together in the completed space that represented their partnership's greatest achievement. The Richard Harcourt Memorial Workshop would serve veterans and teach traditional skills for generations to come. But its deeper purpose had already been fulfilled, proving that two broken people could heal each other by building something beautiful together. 2 years after Jake Morrison first knelt on Vivienne Harcourt's driveway with a worn toolbox and desperate hope, the Harcourt estate had transformed into something neither could have imagined when grief was their closest companion. The mansion gleamed with careful maintenance. Its gardens flourished under Marcus's experienced hands and Jake's engineering solutions, and the workshop complex hummed with daily activity that honored both Richard's memory and the healing power of meaningful work. Vivienne stood in the original workshop where it had all begun, watching Jake put finishing touches on the final piece of Richard's chess set. The White King had taken him 6 months to complete, not because of technical difficulty, but because he'd wanted every detail to match Richard's vision perfectly. Each carved fold in the royal robes, every line in the noble face had been crafted with the patience of someone who understood that some work transcended mere skill to become acts of love. "There," Jake said, setting down his smallest carving gouge and stepping back to examine his work. "King to match queen," completing the set. Richard started. The chess pieces sat arranged on the board Richard had crafted. 32 characters telling a story of medieval nobility rendered in ebony and holly by hands separated by death but united in purpose. Richard's original pieces showed the confident mastery of a lifetime craftsman, while Jake's additions demonstrated the careful reverence of someone completing sacred work. "It's perfect," Vivienne said, running her fingers along the king's crown. Richard would be amazed that his vision found someone skilled enough to finish it with such fidelity to his original concept. Through the workshop windows, they could see the memorial addition where this morning's woodworking class was concluding. 8 veterans worked at benches Jake had designed using principles learned from Richard's journal. Their projects ranging from simple boxes to complex furniture that would grace homes and represent skills reclaimed from darkness. The program had evolved beyond their original vision. What began as woodworking therapy for homeless veterans had attracted attention from rehabilitation specialists, military hospitals, and employment agencies across New England. Jake now supervised 3 full-time instructors and maintained a waiting list of participants who'd heard about the program's success in rebuilding both skills and confidence. "Remember when you thought I might be able to fix a door hinge?" Jake asked with the gentle humor that had replaced his initial desperation. "I remember thinking you might be different from the usual people who appeared at my door wanting something," Vivienne replied. "I was right, though I had no idea how different." The estate grounds showed evidence of their partnership's success. The fountain danced in the courtyard, its music a constant reminder of their first shared triumph. The greenhouse flourished with vegetables that supplied both the mansion and the workshop cafeteria. Even the groundskeeper's cottage had been renovated into comfortable housing for visiting instructors and participants who needed temporary accommodation. Mrs. Chun appeared in the workshop doorway, her face bearing the satisfied expression of someone whose instincts about Jake had been validated by 2 years of observation. "The photographer from Architectural Digest is here for the feature article," she announced. "They want to include shots of the completed chess set in the story about the memorial workshop." The magazine had discovered their work through social media posts by veterans whose lives had been transformed by the program. What started as a personal healing journey had become a model for therapeutic craftsmanship that other communities were attempting to replicate. "I'll handle the interview," Vivienne said. "You should spend time with the afternoon class. They're working on their final projects today." Jake nodded, but paused at the workshop door. "Vivienne, I want you to know something. When I knocked on your door 2 years ago, I was barely surviving. You didn't just give me work, you gave me back my life. Sarah and Emma would be grateful for what you've done." "What we've done," she corrected. "This workshop exists because you understood that healing happens when broken people help each other build something beautiful." As Jake headed toward the memorial addition, Vivienne remained with the completed chess set, marveling at how 2 grieving strangers had found purpose in continuing interrupted dreams. The afternoon light illuminated Richard's original pieces alongside Jake's careful additions, making it impossible to distinguish where one craftsman's work ended and another's began. The estate felt alive in ways she'd never experienced, even during her happiest years with Richard. Where once her wealth had created elegant isolation, it now supported meaningful work that touched dozens of lives directly and hundreds more through the veterans who carried their skills into new careers and stable housing. Her phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Sarah Chun, reporting that another veteran in the program had received a job offer from a local furniture maker. The employment rate for program graduates remained above 90%, with many participants discovering not just woodworking skills but renewed confidence in their ability to contribute meaningfully to society. Through the memorial additions windows, she could see Jake demonstrating joinery techniques to his afternoon students, his patience and encouragement evident in every interaction. He'd found his calling as a teacher, combining technical expertise with intuitive understanding of how skilled work could heal traumatized spirits. The Architectural Digest photographer was setting up equipment to capture the workshop's warm lighting and carefully organized tool displays. The magazine feature would bring national attention to their work, potentially inspiring similar programs. In other communities where veterans struggled with unemployment and homelessness, as evening approached and the day's classes concluded, Jake returned to find Vivienne still contemplating the completed chess set. Together, they watched the sun set through windows that looked out on grounds where productive work had replaced elegant emptiness. "What do you think happens next?" Jake asked. "Next, we keep building," Vivienne replied with conviction. "Keep teaching, keep healing, keep proving that beautiful work can transform lives." Richard's vision was always bigger than one workshop. He dreamed of a world where everyone understood the satisfaction of creating something lasting with skilled hands. Jake picked up the White King, feeling its perfect weight and smooth surfaces. "Then we'd better get back to work." Outside, the fountain's music filled the courtyard where autumn leaves danced in gentle breezes. The estate that had once been a monument to loss had become a testament to renewal, proof that love could continue in forms the dead had never imagined, but would surely have blessed. The chess set was complete, but the real game-building hope from heartbreak would continue for as long as skilled hands and generous hearts could find each other in a world that needed both beauty and healing.